In the autumn of 1839, the red clay of Georgia lay dormant beneath cooling skies. The landscape itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the earth itself resisted the weight of what lay beneath. It was on a Tuesday. The exact day feels immaterial now, robbed of significance by time, when a laborer named Samuel, whose surname history has mercifully forgotten, struck his shovel against stone beneath the main house of the Thornfield plantation. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear it. And if you're enjoying the content, give the video a like to help support the channel. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. The plantation sprawled across 5,000 acres of rolling Georgia terrain, its main house a monument to antebellum grandeur that had begun, even then, to show the first creeping signs of decay. The white columns of its portico remained brilliant in sunlight, but closer inspection would reveal cracks like veins through marble, and the once pristine gardens had surrendered to the encroaching chaos of untended growth. The fields beyond stretched endlessly, though they too bore the marks of neglect. Something had begun to rot at the heart of Thornfield, and the land itself seemed to sense it. Samuel's shovel struck something unyielding. What he uncovered would unsettle the carefully constructed narrative of one of Georgia's most prominent families for generations to come. Beneath the reinforced floorboards of the cellar lay a hidden chamber, sealed with aged timbers of such thickness that their original color had long since surrendered to decades of darkness. The timbers had been fitted with deliberate precision. This was no accident of construction, but rather an intentional concealment. The silence that greeted Samuel when he first peered into that darkness was absolute. It was the silence of a tomb, heavy and expectant, as if the very air had been holding secrets. For so long it had turned stale and suffocating. The walls bore marks, faint scratches carved into the stone, layer upon layer of them, some deep and violent, others barely perceptible, as if made by fingernails worn to the quick. What lay within defied easy categorization. The chamber was approximately 12 feet across and 10 feet deep, its ceiling low enough to force a grown man to crouch. The floor was covered in a layer of fine dust that had accumulated undisturbed for decades. But it was the artifacts of this forgotten space that transformed curiosity into horror. There were garments, children's garments, tiny dresses sewn from fine cotton, too small for any child over 5 years old. Their stitching was meticulous, suggesting they had been crafted with care, yet they lay scattered across the floor like the shed skin of some previous horror. Beside them lay dolls, broken and crude, some fashioned from scraps of cloth and wood, others bearing the scars of violent destruction. One doll had been methodically decapitated. Another bore burn marks across its torso, but it was the ledger that transformed speculation into certainty. Its leather cover was worn smooth by handling, the pages within yellowed and brittle. The handwriting was precise, methodical, the script of an educated hand, the hand of someone accustomed to maintaining records with the meticulous attention of a merchant cataloging goods. And in a sense, that is precisely what this ledger represented. The entries were sparse but devastating in their implications. Names appeared, most of them listed only as first names, sometimes with an initial or a cryptic marker. Dates were recorded with methodical precision. Against many names were notations that seemed to track pregnancies, months noted, due dates recorded, outcomes marked with symbols whose meaning became chillingly apparent only in retrospect. Children's names appeared and then vanished from subsequent entries. Some entries bore crosses. Others bore question marks that hung in the margins like accusations. One entry, dated in March of 1837, read simply, "The Thornfield heir shows the tendency. The bloodline must be maintained, mother instructed. Agreement reached." Below it, in smaller script, A single name was written and then carefully scratched out, so thoroughly erased that even the faintest impression could no longer be discerned. Another entry, dated the following month, noted, "Recent acquisition shows promise for purposes discussed. Her constitution appears suitable. Quarters arranged below, as discussed." The ledger represented a chronicle of something beyond the pale of ordinary cruelty. It was a record of deliberation, of planning, of a systematic approach to horror that transcended mere vice and entered the realm of calculated depravity. Whoever had maintained these records had done so with the administrative precision of a man organizing inventory, yet the inventory in question appeared to be human reproduction itself, manipulated, controlled, documented, with the cold distance of a naturalist studying specimens. A tattered journal lay beside the ledger, its pages loose and water-damaged. The handwriting here was different, rushed, often illegible, filled with erasures and corrections. Coded references appeared throughout, abbreviations that suggested financial transactions, mentions of requirements and obligations, hints of threats and coerced complicity. One entry, written in what appeared to be a female hand, spoke of terror in the night and the master's insistence. Another, written in a different hand entirely, mentioned the child who was not seen again, and concluded with a simple phrase that haunted anyone who read it: "God forgive us all." Buried beneath loose pages of the journal was a single sheet of foolscap, upon which had been written in large, agitated letters, "I will not remain silent. When I reach Philadelphia, I will testify to everything. The names, the dates, the children. God knows the children. If he silences me, let this serve as my testament." The letter was unsigned and unfinished, the sentence trailing into obscurity as if the writer's hand had been stayed by fear, or by something worse than fear. No date appeared on this letter. No indication revealed whether it had been written before the author's departure, or whether it remained only as a desperate prayer, a message cast into the void with no certainty of ever being received. The letter's very existence, however, spoke to something crucial. There had been a threat. Someone had known. Someone had attempted to bear witness, and that someone had fled. The discovery transformed the Thornfield plantation from a mere symbol of antebellum wealth into something far more sinister, a repository of secrets, a testament to the fact that the visible world of refined conversation, polished silver, and elegant dress concealed chambers of horror that history prefers to leave undisturbed. Samuel, the laborer whose shovel had breached that sealed door, would carry the weight of what he had witnessed for the remainder of his days. Some knowledge cannot be unknown. Some truths, once glimpsed, remake the world forever. And yet, the true horror of Thornfield Plantation lay not in what lay buried in that chamber, but in the circumstances that had created it. Circumstances that traced their origin back to the mind and will of a single man, a man whose name appears throughout the administrative records of Georgia's golden age, a man whose reputation among his peers was one of refined sophistication and keen intellect. His name was Edmund Ashford Thornfield, and his existence would come to represent something far darker than any individual act of violence, the terrible effectiveness of evil when coupled with intelligence, position, and power. The investigation that began with Samuel's discovery would occupy the attention of a young historian named Marcus Webb for nearly 3 years. Webb, himself the grandson of a plantation overseer turned merchant, approached his research with the careful methodology of a scientist examining something toxic under glass, with precision and distance, and with the constant awareness that to understand such darkness was to risk contamination by it. Webb's initial research traced the administrative records of the Thornfield estate through public documents. What emerged was a picture of a man obsessed with order, with control, with the precise cataloging of existence. Thornfield's account books were legendary among the plantation's peers, meticulous, comprehensive, noting not merely the financial transactions, but the daily movements of over 300 enslaved people, the output of the cotton fields down to individual bale weights, even the consumption of food supplies tracked with an accountant's exactitude. But embedded within these ostensibly mundane records were anomalies that, once noticed, could not be ignored. Certain expenditures appeared regularly, payments to a physician for house calls that occurred with troubling frequency, purchases of laudanum and other pharmaceutical compounds in quantities disproportionate to the needs of a household, no matter how large, references to maintenance of the East Wing that corresponded to periods of architectural records indicating no such maintenance had occurred. The architectural oddities themselves became increasingly apparent upon closer examination. The plantation house contained passageways that seemed to serve no practical purpose, hidden doors built into seemingly solid walls, a basement level that appeared on certain plans but vanished from others drawn merely years apart. One corridor led to a locked chamber whose key had been lost decades prior. Another descended beneath the main structure to a sealed annex, whose purpose was unmarked on any official blueprint. When Webb examined the records pertaining to the Thornfield family itself, a pattern emerged that initially seemed merely tragic but grew increasingly sinister upon analysis. Edmund Ashford Thornfield had married Catherine Hartwell in 1815 when he was 32 and she was 21. Catherine bore 3 children, a son, Edmund Jr., born in 1816, a daughter, Margaret, born in 1819, and another daughter, Elizabeth, born in 1823. What struck Webb as unusual was the spacing and pattern of these births. Catherine had given birth to 3 children across 8 years, then had produced no further offspring for 16 years. Then, between 1839 and 1843, 4 more children appeared in the family records, documented as children of Catherine and Edmund, yet bearing no mention in the social records that scrupulously tracked such things. Their names appeared in the family ledger, but in no birth announcements, no church records, no acknowledgments in social correspondence. The household staff records revealed something else entirely. They documented a rapid turnover of enslaved women assigned to work within the main house, a turnover far more rapid than simple labor economics could explain. Women would appear in the records for brief periods, sometimes as little as 6 months, and then disappear, with no notation indicating sale, death, or reassignment. In other cases, women would appear for a season, disappear, and then reappear months later in markedly different conditions. Some of these reappearances were accompanied by cryptic notations: returned, reassigned to field work, transferred to external quarters, disposition handled. Testimonies began to surface through Webb's patient interviewing of aging former slaves and servants. An old woman named Ruth, who had worked in the Thornfield household as a child, spoke in hushed tones of the master's terrible hunger and of rooms where the sounds at night meant you must not listen. She recalled a young woman whose name she could only remember as Rose, who had been brought into the house and whose screams could be heard even through the thick doors of the sealed chambers. Ruth had been forbidden on pain of whipping from inquiring what had become of Rose. Months later, a child had appeared at a distant farm that Edmund Thornfield owned, handed to a farmer and his wife with written instructions for its care and a sum of money that ensured their compliance and their silence. A former overseer named Jacob Clark provided written testimony that cataloged systematic abuse. He described Thornfield's cold rationality when discussing these matters, the way he would calmly explain the breeding program he had implemented, using the exact same terminology one might employ When discussing the careful cultivation of livestock, Thornfield spoke of maintaining bloodlines, of selecting appropriate specimens, of calculating outcomes with the detached interest of a scientist experimenting with heredity. But the most chilling testimony came in the form of letters discovered in the estate of a woman named Catherine Hartwell's closest confidant, a woman named Eleanor Foster, who had been a frequent guest at Thornfield Plantation. These letters, written in Catherine's own hand, revealed a woman trapped in a nightmare of her own family's construction. One letter, dated in December of 1832, read, "He speaks of it as inevitable, as something ordained by the natural order. He says that a man of our standing must ensure the purity of the line, even if it requires what he calls temporary indiscretions. He has already begun with the servants. Eleanor, I am terrified of what he means to do next. He speaks of the children, our children, in a way that makes my blood freeze. He says Margaret is becoming such a beautiful young woman. Eleanor, I beg you, if anything should happen, if I should lose my mind entirely, promise me you will remember. Promise me you will tell someone. Someone must know." Another letter, written 7 months later, contained only a single sentence repeated 3 times in increasingly frantic script. "He has infected our daughter with his illness. He has infected our daughter with his illness. He has infected our daughter with his illness." The final letter, undated, consisted entirely of disconnected phrases. "The hidden children. She knew. She has been helping him. The breeding of humans like cattle. My daughter's complicity, my helplessness. The terrible, terrible completeness of the trap. There is no escape. There is no escape." What became clear through these accumulated testimonies and documents was the existence of a systematic program of sexual coercion spanning decades, involving not only enslaved women, but members of Edmund Thornfield's own family. The hidden chamber beneath the plantation had not been constructed to house victims after the fact. It had been deliberately built to facilitate the depravity that Thornfield orchestrated with the clinical precision of a man executing a philosophical experiment in control. The architect of this hidden chamber had specified its soundproofing with meticulous care. The sealed nature of the space ensured that whatever occurred within it would remain invisible to the outside world. The narrow passageway that connected it to the main house could be traversed in the deepest night with minimal risk of observation. The entire structure had been designed by a man who had thought through every detail of his crime, who had anticipated the need for concealment before the crime itself was committed, suggesting that Thornfield had entertained these fantasies of control and violation for some considerable time before acting upon them. The horror of it was not merely in the acts themselves, but in the methodology, the deliberation, the transformation of depravity into something that could be recorded and analyzed like the careful notes of a naturalist. Edmund Ashford Thornfield had possessed not merely the inclination toward evil, but the intellectual apparatus to systematize it, to refine it, to transmit it to others as if it were simply another aspect of the family's domestic arrangements. And therein lay the most disturbing aspect of the entire revelation. Thornfield had not acted alone. The ledger that Samuel had discovered bore not one handwriting but multiple hands. The conspiracy of silence that had preserved these secrets had required complicity from household staff, family members, trusted servants, and business associates. The evil that Thornfield embodied had not existed in isolation, but had metastasized throughout the entire social structure of Thornfield Plantation, like a disease that corrupts everything it touches, transforming those around it into either victims or willing participants in systematic dehumanization. As Marcus Webb's investigation deepened, the full architecture of Edmund Thornfield's depravity emerged from the shadows with the terrible clarity of something long hidden finally exposed to light. What revealed itself was not a discrete series of incidents, but rather a comprehensive system of exploitation that had operated for nearly 3 decades, with the cooperation, whether willing or coerced, of the Thornfield family itself. The journal entries, when assembled in chronological order, created a grotesque narrative arc. They documented Thornfield's initial fantasies, his first acts of coercion, his growing confidence in his ability to act with impunity, and finally his elaborate codification of these acts into something approaching an ideology. Thornfield had developed what might be termed a philosophy of reproductive domination. In letters discovered among his private correspondence, he articulated his belief that a man of sufficient intellect and standing possessed the natural right to manipulate the reproductive capacities of those within his sphere of influence. He wrote in language so disturbing that Webb's hands trembled. As he transcribed it, "The breeding of humans is no different from the cultivation of any valuable commodity. Just as a farmer selects his breeding stock for desirable characteristics, so too must a gentleman of discernment carefully manage the genetic potential within his household. The common man lacks the vision to understand this. He sees the lower orders and his own wife as separate categories of being. But in truth, they are all material to be shaped and directed toward the production of superior offspring. That this flies in the face of conventional morality is merely evidence that conventional morality has been constructed by those lacking the vision to perceive a higher order." Thornfield's private experiments in control had metastasized into something far darker than simple individual depravity. He had recruited his son, Edmund Jr., into his apparatus of exploitation. He had manipulated his daughter Margaret into becoming, in some sense, a willing participant in the victimization of other women. And most chillingly, he had brought his wife, Catherine, into complicity through a combination of psychological manipulation, threats, and the inextricable entanglement of her own identity with that of her family. The evidence suggested that Catherine Hartwell Thornfield had become, over the course of decades, a kind of collaborative victim, someone so deeply enmeshed in the machinery of her husband's depravity that resistance had become nearly impossible. The letters she had written to Eleanor Foster suggested a woman aware of the moral catastrophe unfolding within her own home, yet rendered nearly powerless by the social structures, financial dependencies, and psychological manipulation that bound her to her husband. One letter, written in 1837, contained a passage that seemed to encapsulate Catherine's tragic understanding of her position. "Eleanor, I have come to understand that there is a kind of trap more terrible than any physical imprisonment. It is the trap of respectability, of social standing, of the knowledge that to speak would destroy not merely my tormentor, but my own children, my own name, my own place in society. Edmund has weaponized the very structures that are meant to protect women like myself. My respectability is my prison. My social position is my sentence. He has made certain that I cannot escape him without destroying everything that remains of my dignity and my reputation. I am, in essence, a willing partner in my own degradation, a condition he has engineered with terrible skill." The hidden children, those entries in the ledger that bore no corresponding birth announcements or social recognition, represented perhaps the most damning evidence of Thornfield's crimes. Careful genealogical research suggested that at least 8 children born to enslaved women within the Thornfield household between 1830 and 1843 were the biological offspring of Edmund Thornfield himself. Several others appeared to be the offspring of Edmund Jr., and a particularly haunting notation in the ledger suggested that Margaret Thornfield had herself borne a child at age 16 whose paternity was never clarified, whose birth was never publicly acknowledged, and whose ultimate fate remained one of the investigation's most chilling mysteries. The architecture of the hidden chamber itself told a story that documents alone could not convey. The space had been built to minimize sound transmission. The single exit was concealed behind a false wall that could only be manipulated from within the main house. The chamber contained fixtures suggesting that victims had been restrained, iron rings embedded in the walls, grooves in the floor where beds or chairs had been positioned, scratches on stone walls that might have been made by fingernails or by the fabric of clothing as people struggled against invisible bonds. Most disturbing was the discovery of a small adjacent space, no more than 6 feet square, whose purpose appeared to be storage. Here lay remains that suggested this chamber had housed not only victims but also their infants. Fragments of cloth, small bones whose species could not be definitively determined, and scattered among them several small wooden items that might have been toys or might have been instruments of infanticide, their true purpose lost to the passage of years. The point of no return, the moment when Thornfield's elaborate machinery of exploitation ceased to function as a hermetically sealed system and opened itself to the scrutiny of the outside world, had come in 1839 through the agency of a woman whose name appears in the ledger only as a series of question marks followed by a series of crosses, suggesting that her existence in Thornfield's records had been simultaneously noted and then systematically erased. Based on archival research and testimony from former slaves, this woman, identified as likely being someone known as Josephine or Josephina, had managed to escape the Thornfield plantation in the winter of 1838 and had fled northward. She had carried with her a copy of the ledger, obtained through means now lost to history. In Philadelphia, she had begun to compose a testimony, to gather documentation, to prepare to expose Thornfield's crimes to the authorities. Thornfield became aware of her attempt to bear witness. Several contemporaneous letters suggest he dispatched agents northward to locate her and to ensure her silence through whatever means proved necessary. Whether Josephine met with violence or simply disappeared into the complicated geography of the northern free states remains uncertain. But her attempt to expose Thornfield, though it did not succeed during her own time, had triggered a response from Thornfield that proved to be his fatal miscalculation. In attempting to secure the ledger that she had stolen and to silence her testimony, Thornfield had been forced to make inquiries that drew the attention of Philadelphia's increasingly active abolitionist movement. A lawyer named Harrison Drake, connected to the Underground Railroad, had become aware of Thornfield's searches and had begun his own investigation into the plantation owner's activities. Drake had initiated correspondence with Georgia officials, though his early attempts to document Thornfield's crimes had been thwarted by the simple fact that local authorities had no inclination to investigate a man of Thornfield's standing for crimes committed against enslaved people, crimes that were not technically crimes under Georgia law at all. Yet the very act of formal inquiry had cast a shadow over Thornfield's reputation. The secure isolation that had protected him for decades had been fractured, and in 1839 that fracture had widened into a chasm when Samuel's shovel struck stone beneath the plantation house and breached the sealed chamber of horrors that Thornfield had constructed as his personal monument to human degradation. The aftermath of discovery proved to be as complex and morally troubling as the crimes themselves. Edmund Ashford Thornfield, when confronted with evidence of the hidden chamber and the ledgers documenting his systematic depravity, did not break down or confess. Instead, he mounted a legal defense that proved, against all reason and decency, remarkably effective. Thornfield's attorneys argued that as a property owner, he possessed certain rights over his enslaved property that superseded any moral objections. They contended that the written testimony of enslaved people and former slaves possessed no legal standing. They argued that documents attributed to his wife Catherine could not be verified as authentic, and that even if authentic, they represented the disturbed imaginings of a woman of allegedly fragile mental condition, a condition that several sympathetic physicians agreed to testify had existed, thereby invalidating any testimony she might provide. Most incredibly, they argued that the very structure of the hidden chamber could not be definitively connected to their client, that it might have been constructed by previous owners, and that the ledgers, while certainly disturbing, did not necessarily prove the crimes that had been alleged. A sophisticated campaign of doubt was mounted, a carefully constructed narrative in which nothing could be proven, with the absolute certainty required by law, in which every piece of evidence could be reimagined as ambiguous, misinterpreted, or fabricated. Edmund Thornfield ultimately died in 1852, a death attributed to apoplexy. He never faced trial. He was never formally convicted of any crime. The estate passed to Edmund Jr., who immediately began the process of destroying documents, obscuring records, and rehabilitating the family's reputation through a combination of financial donations to respectable institutions and careful social maneuvering. Margaret Thornfield, the daughter who had been either victim or accomplice, or perhaps both, married a northern businessman in 1842 and relocated to Massachusetts, where she cultivated a reputation as a philanthropist and supporter of the arts. She lived until 1881 and was remembered in obituaries as a woman of grace and refinement. No mention was made of Thornfield Plantation or of the chambers beneath it. Catherine Hartwell Thornfield was removed from the family home in 1845, following what was euphemistically described as a nervous collapse. She was institutionalized in a private sanitarium in South Carolina, where she remained until her death in 1858. The records of that institution, when examined by Webb, revealed that Catherine had spent her final years in what appeared to be a catatonic state, responsive to no stimulus, engaged with nothing, as if her mind had simply ceased to inhabit her body and had retreated to some interior sanctuary where the weight of her knowledge and complicity could not reach. The Thornfield plantation itself fell into decline following Edmund's death. The property that had once been the symbol of Georgia's wealth and order began to crumble. The main house was abandoned gradually as the cotton production of the antebellum South became less profitable. By 1880, Thornfield Plantation was effectively empty, its fields overrun with wild growth, its main house deteriorating under the assault of weather and time. Local people began to speak of the place in hushed, fearful tones. Rumors accumulated that the plantation was haunted, that screams could be heard emanating from its sealed chambers, that spirits of the violated dead walked its shadowed corridors during the darkest hours of night. The hidden chamber, once exposed, was eventually sealed again, not through legal mandate, but through the simple pragmatic decision to reconsecrate the plantation to normal use, to bury the evidence literally as well as figuratively. The ledgers disappeared from the public record. The letters were scattered into private collections or destroyed entirely. The journal entries were fragmented and dispersed. The official narrative became that certain irregularities had been discovered and investigated, that the findings had been ambiguous and subject to interpretation, and that the entire matter was best left to rest. Yet some questions lingered, unanswerable and irresolvable. The ledger had documented 23 children whose origins were explicitly coded as originating from Thornfield's systematic program of exploitation. Of these 23, only 7 could be identified in any surviving records as reaching adulthood. The fate of the remaining 16 remained eternally obscure. Had they died in infancy? Had they been systematically eliminated? Had they been sold to remote plantations in Mississippi or Louisiana? The ledger itself offered no answers, only the cryptic notations that suggested births, followed by marks whose meaning history had lost. One entry in particular haunted those who read it, a brief note dated in February of 1834 that read simply, "The matter of the three has been resolved as discussed. The records will show nothing. Mother will provide her account for the oversight. The child remains with the Western property. Destruction of the evidence is complete." What three? What child? What evidence had been destroyed? The questions hung in the air unanswered, invitations to speculation that could never be resolved because those who knew were gone, and those who remained refused to speak. The deeper truth that emerged from Webb's investigation was perhaps more unsettling than any individual act of cruelty could be. It was the revelation that Edmund Thornfield's crimes had not existed in isolation, but had been systematized, normalized, and integrated into the social structures of a society that was designed to conceal precisely such atrocities. The plantation system itself, with its absolute power, concentrated in the hands of owners, its legal framework that classified humans as property, its social structures that elevated property holders to positions of unquestioned authority, had essentially created the conditions under which such depravity could flourish. Thornfield had not been an aberration, but rather an extremity of a system that by its very nature tended toward extremity. The mechanisms of power that allowed him to exploit enslaved women also allowed countless other planters to do the same, though perhaps with less systematic calculation. The structures that had protected him from prosecution existed not because of individual corruption, but because they were designed to do precisely what they did, to protect the interests of property owners against any claims that might arise from those they claimed to own. The Thornfield case ultimately illustrated a terrible truth about human cruelty and human evil. Evil is most effective not when it is aberrant, but when it is systematic. Not when it operates against the structures of society, but when it operates within them, manipulating them to its own purposes. Thornfield had possessed enough intelligence and education to understand this. He had possessed enough power to exploit it, and he had possessed enough cruelty to act upon this knowledge without the paralyzing weight of guilt or shame that might limit a man of ordinary conscience. 23 years after Samuel's shovel first breached the sealed chamber, Marcus Webb completed his historical investigation and attempted to publish his findings. His manuscript was rejected by every significant publication in the South and by most in the North as well. Publishers feared legal consequences, social ostracism, and commercial failure. Webb eventually died in 1872, his research scattered, his findings largely unrecognized, his attempt to bear witness absorbed into the general silence that history maintains around such matters. The Thornfield plantation itself was destroyed by fire in 1894 under circumstances that were never fully explained. The main house, the outbuildings, the records that remained, all were consumed by flames that witnesses described as appearing almost deliberately methodical in their destruction, as if the fire itself possessed intention. The hidden chamber, now empty for decades, was collapsed by the flames, and when the rubble cooled, there was nothing left to indicate that it had ever existed. Yet the truth, once glimpsed, cannot be entirely erased. In archives and private collections, fragments of the Thornfield story remain. A journal entry here, a letter there, a testimony recorded in someone's margin notes. Those who know where to look can still find traces of Edmund Thornfield's depravity, still can reconstruct, in outline, if not in complete detail, the machinery of cruelty that he had constructed. And in these traces lies, perhaps, the most haunting aspect of the entire tragedy. Thornfield's crimes did not remain as isolated historical incidents. The patterns he instantiated, the methods he employed, the ideology he developed, these echoed forward into time, manifest in other hands, other plantations, other systems of exploitation. The evil he embodied did not die with him. It was transformed and transmitted, absorbed into the structures of society, perpetuated through mechanisms that did not require his individual genius or his particular malice to continue operating. The hidden chamber beneath Thornfield Plantation stands now only in memory, accessible only through the fragments of history that survive. But the systems that created it, that concealed it, that protected it from exposure and from consequence, these systems remain, manifest in different forms, operating through different mechanisms, perpetuating the fundamental dynamics that Thornfield had so perfectly exemplified. The concentration of power in the hands of those who would exploit it, the rendering invisible of those who are victimized, the systematic distortion of truth into acceptable narratives that allow the comfortable to remain undisturbed. History does not end, it accumulates. The ghosts of Thornfield Plantation are not localized to that particular place, but diffuse through time, through culture, through the ongoing structures that continue to permit certain humans to treat other humans as less than human, to convert human suffering into systematic profit, to transform depravity into normalized procedure. Edmund Ashford Thornfield is dead. The plantation that bore his name is ashes. The family that perpetuated his legacy has been absorbed into the anonymous masses of history, but the shadow he cast remains visible to those who know how to see it, a darkness that reminds us that evil is not exceptional, not the work of singular monsters, but rather the inevitable, product of systems designed to permit it, of structures built to conceal it, of societies that choose, again and again, to look away. In the silence of what remains, we hear not the absence of voices, but their suppression, the countless voices of those whose suffering was systematized, documented, and then erased. They speak still in the spaces between the words of official history, in the margins of the records that survive, in the weight of the questions that cannot be answered because those who might answer them chose instead to remain forever silent. And that silence, perhaps more than any scream or any confession, is the true horror of Thornfield Plantation, not what was done there, but that what was done there was designed, constructed, and maintained within a framework that rendered it not merely invisible, but impossible to adequately prosecute, to adequately redress, to adequately acknowledge. The past reaches forward through time with fingers that never quite release their grip. Edmund Thornfield is beyond justice now, beyond consequence, beyond the reach of any human accountability. But we remain, confronted with the legacy he left behind, forced to acknowledge that history is not a safely concluded chapter, but an ongoing text whose sentences are still being written, whose implications continue to unfold, whose darkness extends into the very present in which we exist. We remain, and in remaining, we inherit both the responsibility to remember and the terrible knowledge that remembrance alone is never sufficient to prevent the perpetuation of the crimes that history seeks to obscure.